All right, so here's a brief presentation for you about literature reviews that I think should help to clarify a little bit about what we're up against. So to this point, you've been spending some time in the literature itself, and you've been reading and summarizing and creating an annotated bibliography. And if you did a good, thorough job on that, the literature review actually probably won't be that difficult for you. However, if you did a scant job of that, if you didn't read the articles closely, if you didn't document them well, this could become a little bit more troublesome for you. But all the same, I think everybody is set up to succeed on this because we've been building toward this moment all semester, and this is really where you're going to practice your summarizing and synthesizing skills, and you're really going to become an expert in a particular area. In fact, I would argue that if you're doing this correctly, there's a good chance you'll know more about your individual topic than anybody else on campus. And that's sort of the beauty of doing a literature review, is that it allows you to really understand the knowledge or the current state of affairs about a particular topic. So I'm going to take you through this quick presentation, and I want to remind you that I've shared with you a pretty good archive of resources that you should use to help you shape your literature review. And that includes not only sample literature reviews that should give you some sense of the structure and the tone and the voice, but also other resources that give you some ideas about maybe how to structure them or how to begin them, or some tips about the general research process when you're asked to put together a literature review. So, and there's innumerable reasons why somebody would write a literature review, but the most common ones are to make an argument for their own research. So a lot of times before you begin a research project, you have to show that the question you're asking hasn't been asked before, perhaps, in the way that you're asking it, that it hasn't been approached in the same way that you're approaching it, that your methodology is going to contribute to the knowledge in some particular way, that your hypothesis is reasonable. So you're really trying to show the feasibility, the relevance, the importance of your particular topic. Sometimes you're using a literature review to show somebody the amount of evidence in a particular direction. So you're trying to show them the state of affairs. So there's a lot of reasons, but essentially what it gets us doing is it gets us into the scientific scholarship, it gets us reading it gets us thinking about it, it gets us putting it into conversation with other pieces of scholarship so that we can kind of see that things maybe aren't as cut and dried as they initially seem, that there is some level of dissensus or uncertainty, and it gets us really thinking about what we actually know and what we think we know, and maybe what is less clear. And that's ultimately the goal of science and science writing, is to put that front and center. So let's take a look. So you may ask, what is a literature review? Well, it's really a discussion of published information in a particular subject area. And people write literature reviews not only in science, but also in social science, in the humanities, basically anywhere where new knowledge is being produced. There's a need for literature reviews because they allow us to systematically and methodically look at a body of knowledge. To me, a literature review really represents the state of knowledge in a particular area. And as many of the resources I've posted for you indicate, and as I've said to you a million times, you need to have a narrow focus here, because it's pretty much impossible for you to understand the state of knowledge about something as broad as a whole disease. Now, that doesn't mean that scientists who get paid pretty significant salaries and who devote 40 hours a week to it can't go out and look at a whole disease and write a literature review about it or do a meta-analysis about it. But in the context of this class, we're going to be much better suited to looking at something very specific, a very specific treatment modality, a very specific symptom of a particular disease, a very specific geographic area, a very specific population of people. Again, the further we can refine this, the better off we're going to be, because it gives us an opportunity to read a higher percentage of the available information and knowledge about a particular topic. So I'll give you an example. This has nothing to do with science, since I'm not a trained scientist, but has everything to do with writing literature reviews. While I was in graduate school, one of the things that I did a lot of research on was literacy, so reading and writing skills of adults, mostly young adults. And so that's a pretty general topic. And if you did a search for literacy and young adults or literacy and adults, you would find, if not tens of thousands, certainly thousands of articles written on that topic, books, volumes, edited collections, you name it. So I actually developed an interest in studying the literacy practices and literacy development of rural men in particular. And that was what I did most of my work on in graduate school, was thinking about what can we do to engage young men in acts of literacy. And so when it came time to do literature reviews to understand what people knew about this, I had a very specific frame to look into. I wasn't just looking at literacy. I wasn't just looking at literacy in rural communities. I wasn't just looking at literacy in rural communities of men. I was looking at the literacy of adolescent men in rural communities. And you would be surprised to know that there is a pretty good body of research on this. I've read quite a bit of it and synthesized it, and I can, if we ever had the time, I could tell you about the themes that I've read and what I know. But that's the kind of approach I want you to have in this, is that I want you to become an expert in a particular area. And many of you have topics that will allow you to do this, and that's great. And so whether you're reading about the personality characteristics of specific dog breeds, or you're reading about the health benefits of intermittent fasting, or you're reading about the benefits of and perhaps limitations of music therapy for Alzheimer's patients, you all have pretty specific foci, and you're going to look at those. And ultimately, in your literature review, you are going to share with me the state of knowledge. What do we know? What don't we know? What is there a level of disagreement about? What are the key promises? What are the key threats to these particular topics? And ultimately, that's what a literature review is. So I want to dig in a little bit more with that, but I think most of this week should be spent, from my perspective, you should be spending it reading, taking notes, analyzing, thinking, connecting, even before you begin writing this, because you really need to kind of consistently zoom in and zoom out. Zoom out to ask yourself about the bigger picture, and then zoom in to look at the details that help you to support that bigger picture. So, generally speaking, a literature review is organized in the following way. It has an introduction, which provides background on the topic. It explains the significance or the importance of the topic, so kind of answers the so what, and explains why we should care about the topic. Gives some sense of scope or magnitude or consequences of the topic. It gives some sense of what your literature review covers. That's always a good idea, to express the time frame that you're covering, the types of publications you're looking at, the search terms that you used. And as important as it is to talk about what it does cover, you can also indicate what it does not cover. So there may be a related topic that you didn't cover. That can be useful too. So for instance, if you're talking about music therapy, you may want to indicate that you did not include anything about other types of sound therapy, but you're looking specifically at music therapy. And then you may want to provide some types of thesis or forecasting statement about the themes, the general narrative. What's the story here? What's the general story about this topic, to forecast so the reader kind of knows what you're about to present relative to the literature. The body explores the themes of the literature. So what did we learn? What are the promises? What are the limitations? Where do we have consensus? Where do we have dissensus? Etc. Where are there gaps? And I don't really care how you organize this, but it should represent a synthesis. I don't want you to go through and recapitulate your annotated bibliography, but it should represent. It should be broken into sections and represent the story of the literature. What do we know about this? And I'll give you some ideas in a minute. But ultimately, each of your topics is probably going to necessitate a slightly different structure in the body. Some of you will want to talk about trends. Some of you will want to talk about maybe different symptoms that a particular treatment mitigates. So there's all sorts of different ways, but ultimately you want to segment that or chunk that up into little compartments. And then finally, you're going to write a conclusion, and that's going to discuss what this all means, what its significance, what the significance of the literature is, and what the next steps are. So what else should we study? What does this mean? And puts it in a broader context. So I'm asking you this week to write your introduction And this should be pretty straightforward, but it's good practice. Whenever we're writing an introduction to something, it's good to think of it as an inverted triangle like this with the point facing down. Some people like to think of it as a funnel. And you should generally try to work from general information to more specific information. And since you're all writing about a subtopic within a larger topic, this should be relatively easy. So you want to work from general information to the very specific research question that you're trying to answer or approach in your literature review. So that's relatively abstract, so let me put it into more concrete terms. So, for instance, to go all the way back to the beginning of the semester, where we were looking at caffeic acid and other phenols that are found in red wine and their relationship to heart disease, if you wanted to write a literature review about the current understanding of the relationship between alcohol and heart disease, which in and of itself is probably still too broad of a topic, but for educational purposes, let's run with it. Your introduction may give some background about the rate of heart disease in the United States. And, it's the number one killer of people. It's preventable, that we spend X numbers of millions of dollars treating and preventing it every year. Then you may want to also connect that to the pervasiveness of drinking, the number of people who, consume one or more drinks per day. So you're trying to connect the two topics. Then you may want to introduce that over time there's been a general lack of clarity on the topic. That one study may indicate this, the next study may indicate another thing. And then you may want to give some basic understanding of what we know about drinking and heart disease, and then you may want to zoom in on the exact themes that you find in your literature. And in that way, you move from a very broad topic of heart disease and drinking to a very specific question, which might sound like something like, what are the effects of moderate consumption of red wine on heart disease, according to research? And then you can ultimately give us the state of affairs. But the key is to work from that broad context and give us, to go back, to give us a sense of the background of the topic, why it matters, to give us some sense of what your literature review is going to cover. So in this case, you may say the following review covers literature published in medical journals between 2010 and 2017 using the search terms red wine and heart disease. The following represents a review of 12 articles that relate to this topic, or something like that. That way we kind of understand the scope, the scale, and the aims of the literature review. So think of it as a funnel. It's always good to provide background, to provide insight, and you'll see this in the sample literature reviews I've shared with you. And then right now, other than writing your introduction, the other thing that you should be doing is trying to identify themes in the studies you've read. And so that's where you should be looking at this and thinking conceptually about what are the things that you're seeing come up over and over again. That can be a theme. Sometimes themes can be things also that only show up in one. So sometimes one article or one piece of literature, sometimes it can be an anomaly. So you may point that out in your literature review that all the studies but one found a particular thing, because that is worth noting. Sometimes anomalies are interesting and should be pointed out because they could represent any number of things. Certainly they could represent just a statistical anomaly, but they could also represent the effects of using a different methodology or studying a different population or using a different data set or using a different instrument. But ultimately, you should be looking at these and looking for themes in terms of the findings. Could be the whole findings. Yes, it works. No, it doesn't work. Yes, it mitigates this symptom, but not this symptom. So sometimes you can theme it around symptoms or a similar part of a finding. Themes could be limitations to the research. Could be trends in the research, consistent changes over time. Maybe we're learning more and more and more, or the intervention is becoming more and more reliable. So I want you to think about that and try to find those themes, because those will be the little compartments of information in which you write your body. And then this might help. And this is just a quick screen grab here, but you may want to create yourself a little table like this that helps you organize your research so that you can kind of see them side by side. Now, the annotated bibliography does this to some degree, but having a table like this that's even more fragmented, I guess, and more concise can really allow you to see side by side the themes, the trends, the patterns that might be worth pointing out in your literature review. But in the interest of not overcomplicating this, I do want you to simply think about the literature review as your opportunity to introduce a subject matter or a topic to somebody, a very specific topic, sort of generated through a research question, and then it's your opportunity to share the state of the art. What do we know about this? How effective is it? When is it effective? When is it ineffective? Who is it effective for? So there's all sorts of different ways, and that's why I'm reluctant to tell you a particular way to theme this, but if you look in our resources from the last couple of weeks, you will find some ways to think about this. The only thing I ask is that unless you have a really good reason, try to avoid really simplistic organizational patterns like chronological. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit. It's pretty easy to look at the dates of publication and say, this is what we found out 2010, 11, 12, 13. What I would rather see you do is to be able to look at the whole body of literature and then extract those themes, and that's really what this is about. And so I can't stress enough how important it is for you to take a look at the samples and to see how they approach the literature. But if anybody needs any help with this, this is primarily what we're going to be working on until the end of the semester, and your final draft of this assignment will be due in the final week of the semester. If anybody needs any help with this, and that includes, I'm happy to sit down with you and take a look at the literature with you and help you try to identify these themes or organizational patterns, let me know. I'm happy to do so. I'm available very frequently, and I'm willing to travel and meet you on either campus. So just let me know, and I look forward to hearing from you, and good luck.